Power on.
Welcome, Section 31 Agent. It's time for Sovryn Trek. And here's your host, Brian Sovryn.
You wanted him, you got him, I heard you. You were looking for on Zomia ONE, where is my Sovryn Trek? Well, you've got it, we're back. Boy, it was a hell of a summer. In fact, I talked about this, I want to say, last year, or around the time that we did Zomia ONE, where it was like, there's going to be a time frame. I mean, it looks like in the future, though we're going to talk a little bit about this when we get into everything we have to talk about during Sovryn Trek. But I had mentioned at points that, there's not as much stuff coming out for Star Trek as there is for, like, say, Star Wars, where Rob and I can do TIE Fighter Renegades, easily every month. Hell, we could probably get away with doing it once a week, but we do once a month because that makes sure, we have plenty of news to talk about. And no matter what we do, it always seems to round out to a couple of hours. We'll see how long this episode goes. This is going to be, you're going to get a couple Sovryn Treks this month, because you might even get 3, because I really want to make up for the months that Sovryn Trek did not air. But I had mentioned that, Star Trek, there's not as much stuff coming out. In fact, we haven't had a new Star Trek novel since, well, I guess that was back in July. In fact, I have to review that, The Enterprise War. We're not going to get to that here, but I will get to that eventually. That came out, was that John Jackson Miller did that, the book about Captain Pike, which was an interesting book. I will get to a review of it. That's not the purpose of this episode here, though. But we're not getting another book until into December. And there's the book about Stamets for Star Trek Discovery that's coming out. That's canon, anyway. Comic books, kind of the same score. We did have, I'm going to save the reviews for the recent comic book series that have been running. We'll save those reviews for the next episode of Sovryn Trek. But same deal. So many titles had been canceled. We do have a Discovery title running. I think it's called Aftershock, and then, which has to do with Spock. Then there was also the Q story, series that had been running for 6 issues. And we had the Star Trek v Transformers comic book, which I actually look forward to reviewing that one. I'll just say it outright. I had a great time with that. I had a really great time, partly because I love Transformers, and B, I love Star Trek the Animated Series. I absolutely love it. In fact, another book review that I could do here is the guidebook for Star Trek the Animated Series, or what they didn't call it the encyclopedia. Yeah, they basically call it's the official guide to the animated series by Aaron Harvey and Rich Shepis. I liked it. I would have liked it if it was a little more encyclopedic, but it does give a good overview of the animated series and a lot of secrets into it. But really, if you've ever studied at all anything about the animated series, you more or less know what's in there. So as much as I love that, and I really, really do love that show, and it did an amazing 2 seasons. But regardless, I'll get into a deeper review perhaps on that and talk more about the animated series maybe in the next episode of Sovryn Trek. I do want to open up. We're going to get into a book we are going to review is, and if you listen to my other show, Sovryn Tech, not Sovryn Trek, but Sovryn Tech, if you listen to that, I talked a couple times. We actually it was like 2 climaxes at the end of those episodes where I talked about Star Trek the Motion Picture, because this year we are celebrating the 40th anniversary of its release, which I believe it specifically came out December 3rd or December of 1979 anyway. And at the beginning of this month of October, they re-released both the paperback edition and on Audible, they put up an audiobook version of the novel for Star Trek The Motion Picture, specifically celebrating its 40th anniversary. We are going to talk about that later on. We're going to get into that, as a review, and that's going to lead us, that's going to encapsulate a much larger conversation around Star Trek itself. And there are a lot of large conversations I want to have around Star Trek specifically. But what we're going to open up with is a book review. And it's a couple of books that have come out over. The first one, I want to say, came out in June. And then the second one actually came out just earlier this week in it came out October 15th of 2019. And I want to talk about these two books because, frankly, I think, especially for the asking price, I think that these are two of the best values you can get as far as guidebooks, in-universe guidebooks to the Star Trek that you know and love. And I hope that these don't stop. The two books that we're talking about is Star Trek, the USS Enterprise, and the first one that came out in June was the NCC 1701D for the Next Generation Illustrated Handbook. And they're both by Ben Robinson, who does great work with, he works with Eagle Moss / Hero Collector, who do a lot of the die-cast Star Trek starships out there that, boy, I wish Star Wars would jump on. Like, I wish Star Wars would do a deal with Eagle Moss and release through them because, I mean, their work is just so much quality. I'm looking up right here in my makeshift studio and bam, I mean, like, just the most gorgeous, and they do far more than Star Trek. I look at the Galactica above me, the real Galactica from 79. But anyway, or 78, depends what year you want to run with there. Ben Robinson does great work with them in a lot of their more technical details. Not to say that, like the magazines. So, and I don't know if did I review these on the last Sovryn Trek? Because they have also come out with, and Ben Robinson was behind those, a lot of Starship guides that were, in fact, they have another one coming out in November. I'll look back. If I didn't review the first two, I know they have the guides, which is basically, so when you buy these starships from Eagle Moss, you get a collector's magazine, okay, that comes with them. And the magazine will have technical details within it and like schematics. And they're not big magazines. They're only, maybe 10, 15 pages, something like this. They'll have details in them, or those kind of schematics. And then it'll have it'll be in universe. And then they'll have out of universe details of, how did the designers and creators and everything, the production team for Star Trek, come up with whatever this happens to be. I get as much joy most of the time out of the magazines as I do having the little starships themselves. I really, really do. In fact, a lot of times I buy the starships just because I want the fucking details that come in the magazine, like how big is the ship, whatever its armaments, all this kind of stuff. I want that information in my head, which isn't readily available on, say, Memory Alpha, or it's not in the Star Trek Encyclopedia, like the last edition that Michael Okuda released, and so on. And I'm that kind of fan where I want to know that. Like, I love science fiction, or fiction in general, when it's fully realized. When like you can get that much into detail around everything. And maybe you'll understand more about why I'm into that when we get into some of our conversations later on in this episode of Sovryn Trek. But sometimes these magazines are way off. Like one of my favorite ships was the Prometheus. The Prometheus, which was a ship that could, it was in Voyager, and it could split into 4 or 3 or whatever different ships. It was really, really cool. According to Eagle Moss, their magazines, that ship is basically smaller than, practically smaller than the NX-01. No, the Prometheus is fucking huge. It transforms into, multiple ships. It's a massive starship. And in Simon & Schuster's Star Trek, or rebooted Star Trek universe that they have, that they've been running since 2005, we'll talk a little bit about that later on too when we talk about the motion picture novel. The Prometheus is the flagship of the Federation. It is a huge ship. So they can get certain minor details like really, really way off. However, this does not affect, or the point that I was getting to with that is that they have released what they call these shipyard guides. And in fact, I know one of them I haven't done a review of, and that is the Klingon fleet. They released that, was that in August or July or August or something like that? It was when the Klingon fleet book came out, which that was very well done. But they basically take the schematic section of these magazines and they just compile them all into one book, and they're really great. I really enjoy them, even though again some of the details they fuck up on those. Okay, and there's some disagreement. I mean, within Star Trek there's some disagreement on things anyway, and basically one source will say like the motion picture, the novel of the motion picture says it takes place in the year 2272, but there's some debate as to when the motion picture really takes place. Was it actually closer to 2278? You know, I mean, like, and it's up to some conjecture, and like little details like that you can deal with. But, you know, I do think it's a big fuck up when you get the size of something so wildly wrong. Anyway, that's going to be a conversation we'll get into when I review these books, because these books that I mentioned, the illustrated handbooks for Star Trek the Original Series and for The Next Generation, do have problems. They're not perfect, but they are great for what they are. Now, those shipyard books are awesome. Okay, I mean, they really, really are wonderful. They are a little more expensive than the illustrated handbooks. And they certainly don't have as much information, but they do have a greater breadth, because these handbooks that I'm going to review basically only have to do with 3 ships. The 1701, the 1701A, and the 1701D, and that's all you get out of those. Now, there's a reason that that's all you get out of those, is because much like the shipyard books are just pulling and collecting and compiling information from the Starship magazines, collectible magazines that come from Eaglemoss, these books are really collecting, with some new information, but are collecting stuff from what was called Star Trek Fact Files, which I think had been produced pretty much since the 90s into maybe a little bit into the aughts. So Ben Robinson himself didn't write all of these, but those Star Trek Fact Files, which was part of these were a big deal. You know, speaking of collectible magazines, something that was kind of in the 90s, which was this just insane era of collectability. It's really, folks, you know, one of the first card sets I had, and I'm embarrassed by it, because I am not proud of, I mean, well, I don't think, this is another conversation we'll have later on. I don't think militaries should exist. Yay, shocking, right? And you're talking to a veteran, by the way. So I'm not proud that I had this, but in the 90s, there was so much, you know, the subscription services that we have today, not exactly a new thing. Okay, now they're different today. A subscription service like, say, Spotify or Netflix or something like that, they are different today because, you know, you don't actually get to keep what you have. But the idea of you subscribing and paying a monthly fee to continually get access to new content is not a new idea. It's an idea that's been around for over a century. Okay, people used to do mail order courses that were this kind of thing. But in the 90s, a very popular thing, or what I was going to say to you, okay, was in the 90s, the thing that I wasn't proud of that I had, I mean, this is how crazy the 90s were, okay, is I had a trading card set, and I had the complete set. I bought the complete set. I had a trading card set, you know, like baseball cards, but it was for Operation Desert Shield. We were literally selling trading cards about real world wars that were going on. Because if you know your history, your military history, okay, which rightly or wrongly I'm a student of, if you know your military history, Desert Shield, you might not even recognize that operation. What the fuck is that? That's because in very short order, it would become Desert Storm. Now you know what we're talking about. We're talking about, you know, Kuwait and Iraq and the U.S.'s involvement in that in the early 90s, you know, during the presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush. Originally, it was called Desert Shield. Now, I am sure that if I still had that set, it probably sells for hundreds, if not thousands of dollars, because who the fuck in their right mind, and rightfully so, I mean, I can just imagine people calling this shit out. If you sold trading cards, I mean, trading cards aren't what they were anymore anyway, but if you sold trading cards about a war, About foreign operations. Like, I mean, I could just see people coming out of the woodwork saying, holy shit, what are you doing? Even though we have no problem selling Call of Duty and, well, don't get me started on all that. But that's what the 90s were like, is that you could sell trading cards about running wars, like wars that were going on at that time. Now, another thing that was popular in the 90s, and in fact, a lot of it had to do with fighter jets and a lot of these other things, is you could get a subscription to kind of this concept of a fact file, where it was a small magazine similar to what I was describing from Eagle Moss, with these that come with these starships, that would describe, say, tanks or fighter jets, like the F-15 or whatever else, and you would get, you'd pay so much a month, and they would send you new ones every month. And the first thing they'd send you when you start up the subscription, and usually they'd give you your first one for free, like any good drug dealer would. Woo! But they'd send you this binder. Okay? And you would just fill in this binder with all of these fact files that you'd get, often about real world things. I mean, people would do them for cars, right? Like you could have a classic cars collection, and every month, 1 month you'd get the Packard, you'd get like a 40s Packard or something like that in the mail. The next month you'd get, you'd get a Rambler, like a 55 Rambler or something. And then you'd get the Lemon, and then whatever. And you'd keep getting new ones every month. So they had this for Star Trek as well, basically. And these two books, these two illustrated handbooks, one for, again, the original series, the other for the Next Generation, are basically those compiled. But they run amazingly, as to where at the time it probably would have cost you potentially hundreds of dollars. These books are about $20 a pop. And that, I think, makes them very worthwhile, and they are just as detailed, if you remember what these fact file things kind of look like, for whether it was Star Trek, the military cars, or whatever. You know how detailed these are, and boy, are they. I mean, this is just, I think these are superior to, as beautiful as Michael and Denise Okuda's work on the Star Trek Encyclopedia has been over the decades, yes, because there's multiple editions. I think these, and as great as, my first book that got me into this sort of thing, into like these in-universe technical manuals, was the Star Trek The Next Generation technical manual. Now, there were ones before that, like the one from Franz Joseph, which came out in the 70s, which was the Starfleet technical manual, which is also a wonderful book. There have been plenty of others down the line, and they are great. Like the Star Trek Deep Space Nine technical manual is a gorgeous book. And maybe that's why they don't have a Deep Space Nine one lined up, because that technical manual was so well done. But as far as new books that are available today, and that also cover Discovery, which the NCC 1701 edition of the Illustrated Handbook does cover that, I think these are two of the best books, two best guides to Star Trek that you can buy right now. If you have never gotten into these are the two to start off with. But again, it is based off of, kind of these classic fact files with a lot of updates within them. So they are full color. They are absolutely, like the schematics, the 3D renderings are absolutely beautiful. They go far beyond just the starships and describing the starships. They go totally into the technology, phasers, communicators, uniforms. Everything, so much that you could imagine of life on a starship is covered within these books. And they both chalk in at about almost 300 pages a piece. And for $20 to get that, to get all that is amazing. Now you can also buy these books where they actually come with, one of the diecast starships from Eagle Moss. If you buy the Next Generation edition of that, you'll actually get a 1701D, and it's beautiful. In fact, I have that one. You could buy also the one for the NCC 1701 and 1701A that comes with the 1701A. Now, I already had the Eagle Moss starship for the 1701A, so I didn't get that. But you'll only spend, it's still a great value, because you'll only spend, if you get them on Amazon, it's only going to cost you about $32, something like that. So you're getting a $20 book. And then look, I've bought these starships outright, and they generally cost about $25 a piece. And so you're getting this gorgeous book, and you're getting a gorgeous model starship, for like half the price of both. It's really amazing. So definitely worthwhile on that. But to talk about the contents of the books themselves, like I said, great detail. like showing you, like what sick bay looks like, what the bridge looks like and all of this. I mean, just as good as any technical manual you could buy. It covers that. And there's a lot, I mean, very, very fine detail. They show you like what and granted, a lot of this was in previous Star Trek technical manuals, but I don't think the presentation was as well done. They will show you what the consoles, like the console panels look like. I mean, if you wanted to build your own Enterprise, or bridge set or something like that, these books would really give you the full breakdown on how to do that and how to make it look legit. I mean, they really, really would. In fact, great listener, he shared with me recently a video of like all these, maybe if I think of it, I'll link to it in the show notes. Some of what was in it I already knew about, but they were talking about how in Las Vegas there was plans to, it was like all these wild ideas that Star Trek writers had or Star Trek creators had. And in it, they talked about how in Las Vegas, they were going to build a full-size Enterprise. Like, you would see it. You'd drive into Vegas, and there is a completely full-size Enterprise. I mean, absolutely remarkable to consider that being done. Now, you had Star Trek The Experience at the Hilton there, but this would have been an actual Enterprise, and you would have walked around deck for deck, and, I mean, it just would have been insane. And one of the ways you could do this, and part of the reason you could even pull that off, is because you have all this information about these starships. Again, they are so fully realized, even though they're fictional, that you could actually pull off, building, basically, I mean, I'm sure it would get treated like a hotel, but you could basically pull off a hotel that is a full-sized and fully realized Enterprise. I think they were going to do the 1701A when they were going to build it, but anyway, very interesting. So the Next Generation book is about as good as the Star Trek technical manual, or Star Trek The Next Generation technical manual that came out in the early 90s. And there's not necessarily a whole lot new there to go into, and it does just cover the 1701D. It does not cover the 1701E. Again, it's gorgeous. A lot of great information in there. If you've never really read technical manuals or read any in-universe content for like technical content for Star Trek The Next Generation, it's a great introduction. And it's probably, I would say, while it doesn't have like all the math and everything like the original technical manual does by Michael Okuda, it's much more accessible and readable and has like a flowing linear narrative. So I don't want to say it's a superior book, but if you're new to this sort of thing, it's definitely the way to start. Now, the illustrated handbook for the original series, for the 1701 and 1701A, this is the book where things get a lot more interesting and there's a lot more to say about it. Both of these books are great, like I said, and they're probably the two best books of their type, out there right now that are in common print. But there's never really been, I mean, you had Mr. Scott's Guide to the Enterprise, you had the Starfleet Technical Manual from Franz Joseph from the 70s, but none of them were as comprehensive about like the Constitution class and a lot of the technology from the original series and the original movies, as this is. Now, also, while this is based on fact files from 20 years ago, at least, they did include a lot of new information from Discovery. As gorgeous as this is, and I mean, it is such a well-done book, and it also gives you some very interesting details about the Discovery version of the NCC 1701 under Captain Pike. This is where I get disappointed. And in fact, it's a disappointment with Eagle Moss as well. There is basically no running canon explanation of why the fuck, and there's problems here, okay? But there's no running canon explanation as to why the fuck the 1701 from Discovery is basically twice, seemingly almost like 3 times the size of the Enterprise that we know from the original series, even the movies, okay, which was a bigger Enterprise than the one in the original series because it was a refit. But then to make matters worse, what we know of the Enterprise from the Cage, which more or less looks like the one in the original series. Now, I mean, we know the out of canon, we know the real world explanation for all this. Okay, but I really thought this was a missed opportunity because I mean, Eagle Moss, which put this book out as well, they have a license with Paramount/CBS, they should be able to talk about this shit. And if I was CBS and Paramount, which, by the way, that merger, we talked about this on Zomia ONE Wednesday Q&As, but Paramount and CBS are one company again. So all these copyright issues that we've talked about in past Sovryn Treks, as well as TIE Fighter Renegades on Zomia ONE, shouldn't be an issue anymore. Shouldn't be. Maybe there's something else going on, but they really shouldn't be. But I would have, I mean, those are kind of the real world explanations as to why there's, you know, the 1701 has had so many different iterations within itself. But yeah, I really wish they would have explained and gone into, okay, like, or show some half steps of the evolution from, say, the 1701 in Discovery to the 1701 in the original series. I really would have loved that. And it's a missed opportunity for this book. And they had the time. They really had the time to add that in. Because again, this book just came out a couple days ago. Okay. I had it pre-ordered for quite some time. I knew it was planned to come out for quite a while. You know, and so I don't know why they didn't do that, but they just kind of roll over it. And in fact, one of the most interesting omissions in this book is, and I haven't read the entire thing yet, but I've skimmed through it, is there's basically no discussion over how big the original series Enterprise is. And in fact, the original 1701 is. And in fact, I think they ignore, because in the guide for the Next Generation, it gets mentioned multiple times. Okay, in the same series, same illustrated handbook, just for, the 1701D. I think they probably omitted that, because there's no way that wasn't mentioned in the fact files. They probably omitted that because, I don't know, maybe the creative team of Star Trek right now is going to somehow resolve that and change information retroactively or something, which I'd actually be fine with. If they want to come out and say, yeah, all those sizes that we talked about, well, actually, they're about half the size of everything we described. Because, again, in Discovery, all the starships are 2 to 3 times the size of all starships you had ever known previously in Star Trek. That doesn't make any sense, especially since it's effectively a prequel to everything Star Trek except for Enterprise. The show Enterprise. So, I kind of feel like they purposely withheld it's amazing for an illustrated handbook that has so much detail to not tell you how big the Enterprise is. And really, it's because they'd have to give you like 3 or 4 different sizes for it over its lifetime, from 2245 to, well, basically 2285. You go from the 1701 to the 1701A within that 40 years, but you get my point. So, but overall, it's really, really stunning. In fact, you do get some of the details you do get here are unique to the fact that they are covering the era of Discovery, right? Because we see Pike and Pike's Enterprise during that. In fact, another thing we're not going to get into this episode is a review of the recent short treks that have come out in October 2019, both of which had featured Captain Pike and the Enterprise to some degree. We're not going to talk about that here. Okay? Not right now. We're going to save that because fuck. Were those horrible. Anyway, a lot to, and also there's a lot of details from the cage in this. So you get technical details from Discovery, the cage, and the original series and the movies, and it's a very complete package. This book especially, the illustrated handbook for the 1701 and 1701A, is, practically priceless because we've never really had a book like this. The illustrated handbook for the 1701D, we've had the technical manual for decades now, and it was so well done. If that book also covered the 1701E, again, it would have been covering an entire different class. Then it would have been a little more invaluable. But this one, this is just one of the best Star Trek books, in my opinion, that you can buy. Conversation around do we even want Discovery content in our technical manuals and in our canon books? That's another conversation for another time. But it's here for you if you actually happen to like Discovery. There's a lot to take in. So yeah, Ben Robinson did a hell of a job here. I'm very impressed with the amount of in-universe content and discussion and a lot of new information that's included within this. And I mean, I almost enjoy, like, there's even schematics for one of my favorite phaser designs was from Star Trek 6. Star Trek 3 and Star Trek 6 have my two favorite phaser designs, and you get breakdowns of those in here. So like, I almost like the content that's not about the starships themselves, because it covers really like life on a starship more so than any other book I can think of has for Star Trek. I almost like that more than I like the actual breakdown of the starship itself. So just fascinating reads. I can't recommend both of these enough. In my, kudos to Ben Robinson for putting these together. So that's the first half of our show. We're going to get into another review, and which is also going to lead to a larger conversation about Star Trek in the abstract. We'll get into that once we come back from the break. You're listening to Sovryn Trek. We'll be right back with more.
Beyond the moon,
fighters, wave after wave after wave,
lies a lone outpost in space.
A potentially dangerous alien technology was smuggled aboard this station.
Beyond the stars,
blood calls out for blood,
lies a dream for universal peace.
One night you'll wake up and find our teeth at your throat.
Beyond imagination,
who would do this? Why?
Lies Babylon 5, the series.
Babylon 5 is available for download on your favorite torrent site. See it now to experience the greatest show in television history, Babylon 5.
We are back with some more Sovryn Trek. And before we get into this next book review, which again is going to lead to a large conversation about Star Trek, something I neglected to mention. So look, I don't just collect. I get all of these technical manuals as they come out. They're in many ways, they're like my favorite books. Okay. I could go into the reasons as to why I enjoy reading about fictional universes as if they were real, like reading encyclopedic and technical content from them. But maybe that's a conversation for another time. But regardless, I don't just get them for Star Trek. Oh no. I also get all of these Star Wars ones. In fact, I have a massive collection of them. And a lot of times I get them because, in fact, the physical editions. Now, if you were ever in the studio, you might not actually see the books, or if you do see them, you wouldn't see them for long. And that's because I get them all scanned, because a lot of these, they don't allow you to buy an ebook version of them, because that's just what I do. I love ebooks. And one of the reasons I actually love ebooks is because they are so easily searchable, because not every book has an index in the back. But I got to tell you, so I do get all of the Star Wars ones. In fact, I have some of the latest here. I have the new edition Star Wars Character Encyclopedia that just came out in September, which is fully revised and updated. This is a book clearly meant for kids. It's not a big book at all. And the other book I have, this is only, how many pages we got here? Yeah, it's a couple hundred pages. And then I also have, which just came out this month in October, is the Ultimate Star Wars, the new edition of that, which is part of the Journey to the Rise of Skywalker. Okay, so that's the newest edition of that. And there have been like 3 or 4 of those. And those Ultimate Star Wars basically acts as a Star Wars encyclopedia. Now, they're nowhere near as good. Of course, what metrics make good, but they're nowhere near as good, or I would dare say even as comprehensive as, say, the original Star Wars encyclopedia that came out in the mid-90s by Stephen Sansweet, or the big, was that like a 3-volume set? I had it. I didn't bring it with me when I moved to New Hampshire 8 years ago. But there's that big 2 or 3 volume set one that was also by Stephen Sansweet that came out in the aughts, maybe it was like 2010 or something like that. Came out just before Disney bought Star Wars out, or bought Lucasfilm. And here's the thing, is that Star Wars manuals now, and they've been getting progressively smaller and less detailed. Like they used to come out with, you would have the incredible cross sections, which was really, really impressive at the time. And then those would be coincided with the release of a visual dictionary. Lately, though, they've they've really combined the incredible cross sections and visual dictionaries into one book where it's just the visual dictionary. And even the visual dictionary has become much more of a kid's book than it was like a more serious, like the books that the illustrated handbooks for the 1701, 1701A, and 1701D that we reviewed in the last segment. I mean, those are clearly for adults, or for mature people, I guess I should say, people of a very high reading level, which is great. But all of these Star Wars guides, like the Ultimate Star Wars book, the Character Encyclopedia, they have been getting progressively dumber, really since 2013. And it's annoying, quite frankly, because, I mean, it's not the cheapest enterprise, no pun intended, to buy these things, okay, and get them scanned. But, at the same time, like, I still kind of do it because there's so many interesting little details that you find out about varying characters within Star Wars, but it seems like they're just getting dumber. But the nice thing is that with Star Trek, they seem to be getting progressively more technical, which I'm really happy about that. So yeah, I want to give credit to Star Trek for continuing to do grown up technical books, as to where Star Wars used to do, in many ways, did the better and the more comprehensive technical manuals. They're just getting dumber by the day. And you could say, well, that's the market speaking, because Star Wars movies or whatever are made for, are made for little kids. No, no, I'm sorry. Either The Last Jedi is good for the reasons that a whole bunch of people on YouTube and wherever else say it's this like tremendous work of art by Rian Johnson, or that movie just straight up failed as a kid's movie. Like, let's be honest about that. You can't have it both ways. It can be for both, but then you can't write off, well, these guidebooks and whatever else, these encyclopedias and whatever for Star Wars, they should be made for the dumbed down for the kids, and then tell me that the major releases within that franchise are these works of high art. Like which is it, folks? In that sense, you can't be both. So, whatever, kudos to Star Trek for continuing to get even more technical as time goes on. I really have to give it credit there. But that's really, I hate to say it, and believe me, I hate to say it. I cannot begin to tell you, and if you've listened to me for years, you can't help but know, but I cannot begin to tell you how much Star Trek means to me, and how much Star Trek has been a major part of my life. I can't remember a part of my life, a time in my life, without Star Trek. I absolutely cannot remember when that was. And Star Trek, I mean, look, I've said this, many other cultural commentators, sociologists, and others, whoever is professional when it comes to this sort of thing, even if, I know I have a lot of libertarian ANCAP listeners, there is a podcast put out by the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank out of Washington. They did a Star Trek podcast that I thought was absolutely fucking brilliant. It will change your perspective of Star Trek. It is amazing. If I think of it, I'll put that in the show notes too. There's a lot to put in the show notes, but if not, you can go and find it. Okay. They also did one about Star Wars, and it wasn't as nowhere near as interesting, but the Star Trek one was positively fascinating. And even in that, okay, even if you're coming from a more, because Cato's a little, they swing pretty conservative, okay, even if you're coming from that conservative, libertarian, ANCAP, or whatever bent, they admitted on that show just how subversive, culturally, mentally, that Star Trek has been over its 40-year history. And, I mean, you'll hear that, but the amazing thing is, and this is why I consider it a matter of fact, not a matter of opinion, okay, or that it just comes from a specific ideological persuasion. Just about every ideological persuasion that I hear from, everybody, I mean, look, when I was, and we're going to get into our review of Star Trek The Motion Picture, from when I was raised Jewish, when I was raised when everybody converted to Christianity and I was going to church and everything, like, there is no group out there that doesn't try to claim Star Trek in some form or fashion in the inspiration of what they do, or they don't use it in a sermon, or they don't use, I mean, Star Trek is, and this is why Star Trek matters, and why, to say that it's a big deal to me, we are not, by nobody's measure, we are not just talking about a television show. We are not. And there is nothing, I can't think of a single piece, as much as, and look, I think there's things better than Star Trek as far as entertainment and media goes. I think Babylon 5 is better. Not by much, but it is. I think it's the only thing better, make no mistake. Okay. As far as like in a comparable fashion. But there is nothing Babylon 5 does not get talked about in sermons, or at least commonly. Babylon 5 does not get talked about, in a lot of contexts that you will find Star Trek talked about. It is impossible for something to be as discussed in as many different ideological persuasions and in as many venues to just be a TV show. That is impossible, to just call it a TV show. You can't. You can't even just call it movies. You can't call it books. You can't call it comic books. When something has become that ingrained in civilization, it is something more, and it is something special. And as be it on the left, the right, anarchists, whoever, whatever. Okay, I mean, Satanists. In fact, I talked about this when I was reviewing a book for a Zomia ONE Underground Wednesday Q&A. Was it Phil Gilmore or Peter Gilmore? He in the Satanic Scriptures, he dedicates that book to a few names, but one of the names he dedicates it to is Gene Roddenberry. And that's the amazing thing. I mean, like, I can see, the Church of Satan giving credit to Star Trek for showing, for showing what humanity can be. And that's exactly what Peter Gilmore said. And then I can hear it getting preached about in a sermon in the same moment. You tell me. No, Game of Thrones isn't even at that level. Go fuck yourself if you think it is, because it's not. That's how big of a deal this is. Star Trek, to be very clear, it is not just a television show. It is a subversive force. And Satanists, Christians, lefties, conservatives, libertarians, go down the list, you pick your group, they all admit it. Now, they might see it as subversive for different reasons, but unquestioningly, and yes, I use that word literally, unquestioningly, it is a subversive force, and I dare say it is the most subversive force. In fact, I would say that Star Trek, people talk about Western civilization. Now, I've rallied against this. If you ever listen to my show, Sovryn Trek, you know the score. I've gotten on about this many times, where I'm just like, wait, what the fuck is even Western civilization? Like, I don't understand. I get the more common concept of it, that it is some kind of like philosophical progression from the ancient Greeks through the Christians and then up to today, and that we still have Western civilization. Now, I've debunked a lot of that horseshit many times, but something that other sociologists and other people kind of come out with, other thinkers, shall we say, come out with, is that really it's not Western civilization versus like the East or whatever, but there is a modern, and it's more modern civilization and ancient civilization. Basically, that you today have more in common with someone in, Korea than you do with, if you're in America, like me, than you do with an American from 200 years ago. You have more in common with them than you do that. So the divide can't be West and East. The divide is modern and old or ancient or whatever. Okay. And I think that's a little more accurate. But what do I think created this modern civilization? I'll say I think Star Trek absolutely is what and you think that, I could be a little broader and say it's science fiction that created modern civilization and modern thinking as we know it. And if you want to go that broad, we can, but Star Trek was such an integral part of that, and I'm going to get into that conversation. We need to do the review of Star Trek the Motion Picture, but that's going to lead to something bigger. Star Trek absolutely is the Trojan horse that brought on modernity as we know it. Or, if you're conservative, maybe they call it postmodern. I don't know, but I do know what you're talking about. But if you want to go that way, fine. But the world very much that we live in was brought on by that. Okay. Now, that said, okay, we are going to revisit this conversation. And it has to do with science fiction as a whole, but Star Trek's place in it is something that I don't think until just recently. There's a book I'm going to tell you about. Okay, another book. And I'm not going to do a full review of it here, but there's another book I want you to read that I think is one of the most important books you could possibly read. For me, it was it was absolutely a life-changing book for me. As somebody who has, cut me right now, science fiction pours out of my veins. Okay. It's just the ink of science fiction pours out of my veins if you cut me. It is as core to me as anything else could be. All right. On Sovryn Trek, I've talked about you have the scientific method. Well, on Sovryn Trek, I've talked about the science fiction method. That's a very real thing. And we're going to explore more of what that means in a minute here, or in a few minutes here, after we go through this review of Star Trek: The Motion Picture. Okay. But you'll see what I mean by that it's not science. Just like Star Trek is not just a TV show, science fiction is not just fiction. It is something more. And it has always been, by design, meant to be something more. Well, we'll talk about that. Now, let's get into Star Trek: The Motion Picture, the novel. So I recently listened to the novelization, the audiobook of it, and this is something that did not previously have an audiobook, as far as I know. Maybe it did, because Simon & Schuster used to be one of the major companies that would put out audiobooks on cassette. That was a thing, as well as CD. It may have existed before. If it did, I don't know about that, but you're definitely going to want the modern one either way, because they got Robert Peikoff to do the narration, and he does a lot of Star Trek books, and he is tremendous. He just does a solid job with voices, intonation, and just like even the pace, the tempo at which people talk. He hammers it, and he just nails it every time. It's really impressive. So the audiobook, if I was just going to rate it on a production level, I would give it, out of 10, I'm going to give it a solid 8. I wish, like some Star Trek novels will do, where they put in special effects, I wish there were special effects in it that would have taken it to another level. I think that when you're doing a 40th anniversary, that should have been there. And the other point I'm going to take off is for this 40th anniversary presentation overall, in that there's no added materials. I would have brought on Judith and Garfield Reeves-Stevens, had them do a whole breakdown of, the effect of Star Trek: The Motion Picture on the cultural, cinematic zeitgeist. I would have done something. Or even because I'm kind of going to do this here, I would have done an exploration, an exposition on the differences between the novel and the movie, because there are some significant differences. Not that one really contradicts the other, just there's a lot of things that get explored more as only a novel can, as only the written word can, that does not show up on the screen. And so I think that the novel is an fantastic companion piece to the movie. And something I realized as I was reading this, so I've read this book a few times over, not the audiobook, but the actual novelization. I read it many times when I was a young person, when I was a teenager, for a few reasons. One of them is that this is considered, in Simon & Schuster, who has been putting out basically, the names might have changed here and there, but they have been putting out Star Trek novels for, it's almost its entire history, but certainly since the 80s, they have been doing it. And they did a major reboot of where they had, like, they almost did like a crisis. They didn't do a Crisis on Infinity Earths, but they did a reboot of all of their novels back in 2005, to where everything that they were doing previously, for everything from DS9 to the original series, the Enterprise, Voyager, Next Generation, whatever, where they started to have it be a cohesive universe and not just these disparate stories that the Star Trek books used to be. Star Trek books had never been considered canon. They're still not considered canon other than the Star Trek Discovery books. And I would assume, because we have a Star Trek Picard book coming out in February, that book will also be considered canon. But otherwise, they are not considered part of... Gene Roddenberry has always been very clear in that they are not a part of the broader universe. Do we have to believe Gene Roddenberry all the time? No, not really. because he would also say the animated series was not part of Star Trek canon, even though I think it sits beautifully within the canon, and is a lot of fun and covers some really interesting things. In fact, we'll talk more about the animated series probably when we review the short treks, because there is some relationship with the short treks, especially the trouble with Edward, as shitty as it. We're there's something that makes sense within that based upon something else that happened in the animated series. But regardless, actually paying attention to Gene Roddenberry is a big part of this conversation. So, the novelization of Star Trek the Motion Picture was written by Gene Roddenberry, while the ideas itself, or the overall narrative concept, may have come more from Alan Dean Foster or Harold Livingston. As far as I know, Gene Roddenberry, I always thought he ghost wrote this, but no, I guess he basically really did write this. And like I said, I read this many times as a teenager, but at the time I didn't really grasp everything that was being said. And so rereading this, it was like reading it anew, reading it afresh. And I think if you have a knowledge of the original series, and you don't need a knowledge of any other Star Trek, if you have some knowledge of the original series, this is one of the, I'll just say it, this is one of the greatest books you'll ever read in your life. It is a wild book. Does it have better pacing? Are there more things that have, is there more action than what's in the movie, right? Because, so many people there's so many derogatory terms for Star Trek the Motion Picture, like it's Star Trek the Slow Motion Picture, people say that. There's a lot of this, okay? I totally disagree. Star Trek the Motion Picture, in fact, you can listen back to old episodes of Sovryn Trek where I do a breakdown, I do a ranking of every Star Trek movie. Star Trek the Motion Picture is my favorite Star Trek movie. It's not only my favorite Star Trek movie, that if I didn't have the rule of I don't count franchise films as in movies that have multiple sequels or prequels, if I didn't allow those to be considered my favorite movies, Star Trek the Motion Picture would be just my favorite movie overall of all time. I think it is such a beautiful exploration, internally, externally, of life in space, and so much more. And it is Star Trek fully realized. And I think this novelization adds on to a lot of that. And I have to check myself in that I've read this book so many times over, especially when I was growing up, that I think a lot of the little things that happen underneath in this book unconsciously, and maybe somewhat consciously, but certainly unconsciously, colored what I was seeing in the movie version of Star Trek the Motion Picture. Because there are a lot of things that go on that you don't get in the film, or that you don't get in certain versions of the film. Like a lot more exploration of who the Deltans are, right? Leah's characters. You find out that they are actually giving out the Deltans. It's not that just that they're like this highly sexual species. Okay, and they are, but they actually give off pheromones that basically give everybody a hard-on, or give the opposite sex, some kind of excitement. Maybe it works on the same sex too. I don't know. But you get a lot of these little things that suddenly, this makes a little more sense, and blah, blah, blah. Where to go with this? I think that this is a tremendous book. And again, especially if you're just considering Star Trek the original series and then you go to this, Star Trek becomes very exciting when you read this. It's already exciting with the original series, but it becomes very exciting with this book. But what really stands out are a lot of little things. And to give you a comparison, or to give you an analogy, I don't think let's take a book. This is basically, in my opinion, Star Trek the Motion Picture, the book, is Gene Roddenberry's, and let's be very particular, Gene Roddenberry's Bible for Star Trek. This is Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry's version of Star Trek fully realized. A lot of people think the Next Generation is Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek fully realized. No. And I understand how much was borrowed from the motion picture, including even this novel, and put into the Next Generation. But there are so many wild little concepts in this book. Okay, this is effectively the Star Trek Bible. Okay, and that's part of why this book is so important, I think, to read if you are a Star Trek fan and you never read it. And because there's so many little things in here that you're just going to go, what the fuck? Okay, so by comparison, or as an analogy, In the Bible, as in Torah, okay, in the West, right? People commonly consider the Bible. I don't think people realize how there's a lot of these little verses, especially in the Old Testament or in Torah, that have created entire schools of thought, have created entire investigations. One of the most famous would be Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, which talks about the giants or the Nephilim. And it's one quick verse that talks about it's like the angels came down and slept with human women and they had kids and these kids were giants and blah, blah. You can interpret that little verse in a lot of different ways, but that has led to the work, The 12th Planet by Zechariah Sitchin, that has led to so much shit. There's entire books about the Nephilim and they're only mentioned once or twice in the entire Bible, most importantly in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. And it's just one verse. And you can talk to just about any Christian or Jew, and including myself, who is just like, wait, could you expand on that? Wait, what was that verse? It's one sentence, more or less. And you just want more out of that. And in the novelization of Star Trek the Motion Picture, you get so much of that. You get all of these little moments in many chapters and it's not a long book. The audiobook you can listen to, or the audiobook itself is only 6.5 hours long. So if you do that at 2x or a little over, you can have this read inside of 3 hours, and it's a short read but a brilliant one. But there's a million points in it where you go. I found myself when I was listening to the audiobook, I kept rewinding. I'm like, wait, what did he just say? I know I sound exasperated, but that's because this was so. Listening to this book, reading this book was so revelatory. In fact, I went and got the EPUB instantly because I wanted to search for some of these words that get, and things that get talked about. And I'm like, wait, what is that? It's wild. Now, another thing that if I think of it, I'll put in the show notes. If you go to the Memory Alpha, which is basically the Star Trek Encyclopedia Online, if you go to Memory Alpha, the entry on the novelization of Star Trek the Motion Picture. Actually, if you just read about Star Trek the Motion Picture, just the development, you learn a lot of very interesting things about Star Trek that we're going to talk about here in a minute. But if you read the entry on the novelization, and if you go down to references, you're going to find some very interesting things. And they don't even cover all of it, because there's other stuff in it where you go, whoa, what the hell did he just say? Just to give you some examples. So again, the narrative itself is not very much different from the movie that you know, okay? But there's just a lot of added details, and there are things that make a lot more sense. For example, one thing is that you find out about a character. So when there's the transporter accident, very memorable scene in the movie. There's a transporter accident where Commander Sonak, who was originally going to be the science officer aboard the Enterprise, he dies in the transporter accident. But it's not just him. There's someone else. Well, in the book, you find out who that is. It's Vice Admiral Lori Siana. And you find out that she was a love interest for Admiral Kirk at the time. And so there's a lot more heartbreak. Even though the movie never identifies her, there's a lot more heartbreak around that in the novel. And so that adds a little something extra, to some depth to what's happening in the movie, if you know what's going on in the book. And there's nothing to contradict it either in the movie. So it might as well be, and this gets, I don't want to get sidetracked on this, but there is the conversation to have around, where do movie novelizations fit in as far as canon? I get it that Gene Roddenberry said that, and this is the only Star Trek book he ever wrote, even though he was going to do another one called The God Thing. But anyway, when you're written by the creator, you would think that, okay, this isn't just some simple novel, this isn't just some Star Trek book that's not canon. There's probably a lot of elements here that are interesting. One thing, for example, is that in the novelization is when you find out the class of the Klingon battlecruisers in the movie are Katinga class. That would end up being canon, from then on to today. But it was only really mentioned in the novelization. Clearly, even the writers for The Next Generation, picked off from the motion picture novelization. So where do novelizations fit in as far as being canon, novelizations of movies? I think they sit in a certain gray area. So there's, within that itself, it's interesting to read this sort of thing. Now, to give you an example of some of the wild shit that's in this book. So, and you know, just within the first 5 minutes that you're in for a treat, because it opens up with a preface by Admiral Kirk in the first person saying he knows, or like he's like, understand, like as I remember it, this is the accurate encounter with V'ger, blah, 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 blah. After that, there's also a preface by Gene Roddenberry, and Gene Roddenberry is writing it as if he's writing the history of the future. Like he's saying, yeah, Admiral Kirk asked me to write this, and I think that's cute, by the way. Like I like that Gene Roddenberry is in some ways bending reality and breaking a fourth wall at the same time. It's cute, but and he says some of the most beautiful things in that preface, like where he, in fact, some things that I would say contradict and point at a conversation we're going to get into later, is just how little of Star Trek Gene Roddenberry was really involved with. You know, and we're going to get into that. But like one of the things he says in his preface, we'll talk about the Admiral Kirk preface in a second. In the author's preface, Gene Roddenberry makes it very clear that writing Star Trek is him getting the opportunity to show humanity not just what it could be, but how it should be, in his opinion. And he has this beautiful line about how we are discovering that love is somehow inextricably linked with truth. Like love has to be a part of truth. It's a beautiful statement that fits in very much. In fact, maybe I'll pull it up here, but it fits in very much with, well, frankly, I'll admit it, my own ideology. And that's part of what was so beautiful in reading this book, is that there's so many things that get just kind of offhand said that fits in with my own thoughts. And, you know, I don't know what came first, right? Did I just naturally progress to these same thoughts same conclusions that Gene Roddenberry came to? Or did I unconsciously pick up on them when I read this book as a kid? And then they just became integral to me. And just maybe in the past few years, I've been able to live in judgment-free zones where those ideals have been allowed to flourish again. I can't say, but it's really, really, really beautiful. And actually, I just pulled it up here. So I'll read the whole quote. This is from the preface by Gene Roddenberry, not the preface by Admiral Kirk. We're going to get to that in a second, because again, that just opens up all kinds of crazy shit. Here we go. I have always looked upon the Enterprise and its crew as my own private view of Earth and humanity in microcosm. If this is not the way we really are, it seems to me most certainly a way we ought to be. And Stanley, break it in for a second there, okay? I actually like the way that he says, or how he says, it's a way we ought to be. Not the, but a. Anyway, reading on. During its voyages, the Starship Enterprise always carried much more than respect and tolerance for other life forms and ideas. It carried the more positive force of love for the almost limitless variety within our universe. It is this capacity for love for all things which has always seemed to me the first indication that an individual or a race is approaching adulthood. I believe that we are at last beginning to understand that love is somehow integral to truth. Much of my pleasure in Kirk, Spock, McCoy, Uhura, Scotty, Chekhov, Chapel, and Rand had to do with such thoughts. I've always found some hope for myself in the fact that the Enterprise crew could be so humanly fallible and yet be some of those greater things too. It's a beautiful statement, but I think it's one of many thoughts, frankly, that you see put on display by Gene Roddenberry himself, the great bird of the galaxy, right? The creator of Star Trek. That you hear throughout the book. And a point that we're going to spend more time on later is that this book, Star Trek the Motion Picture, is Gene Roddenberry's, not, Alex Kurtzman's, J.J. Abrams', Rick Berman's, Brandon Braga's Star Trek. This is Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek in the raw, fully realized, with him having total control. And that's part of the beauty of this book. And, well, again, we'll explore more of that a little bit later. But now let's skip to, as beautiful a statement that is, let's skip backwards to Captain, or Admiral Kirk's, in this case, because he's Admiral Kirk in Star Trek the Motion Picture. Let's go to Admiral Kirk's preface, Okay, I'm not going to read the whole thing here. Go buy the audiobook. I'll put a link in the show notes if I think of it, and get your hands on it. There are some really, really wild fucking things in this. Okay. For one, just in the preface, this isn't even the first chapter, and things get wild there too. Okay, but just in the preface, he talks about these, like, out of nowhere. He talks about how there are these things, these new humans, which are basically like these humans that are telepathically linked, and that a lot of humanity on Earth specifically are these new humans. They are, and he's an older type of human. And in fact, Starfleet specifically, and I guess he's saying he's more individualistic, more old-fashioned, and Starfleet is specifically grooming those type of humans for these deep space exploration missions. And in fact, Captain Kirk was one of the first class to come out of Starfleet Academy that way. Later on in the book, you get an interesting quote where these new humans, which again seem to be more of the majority on Earth. You also find out Decker was kind of taught as one of them through this philosophy of unity. Again, this is the weird shit that comes out of this. We get no exploration. This never gets touched again in Star Trek. This idea that humanity is evolving in the 23rd, in the 23rd century. But later on, you find out these new humans are debating whether or not Starfleet is necessary, even ethical. They're taking problems with basically that this is a space military organization. But also these new humans don't make great, at the very least, captains in Starfleet, because as they encounter, say, more advanced or mature species out in the galaxy, that they can't really handle, they kind of lose themselves in these more advanced, if you want to call it that. I mean, that's kind of subjective, but more advanced species. It's just wild. And it's really your first inclination in that, oh boy, we're in for something special. This is going to be a trip. And there's a lot of little things like this concept of new humans. There's a lot of little concepts, little nuggets that get dropped throughout this book that you wish were a part of Star Trek. You're like, oh, let's explore that more. What does that mean? What is that talking about? And again, the new human thing, it's one sentence, and then you get a couple other very small mentions throughout the novel about them. But also, again, this points out what I was saying earlier before we get into this review, that, the great thing about ebooks is that you can very quickly do a search, and Control F and find every reference to new humans. And you get to explore it at least a little bit more. But this is something that, I wish they would have talked about more. But that's just for starters. Okay, so you get that. But then you open up in the first chapter. Okay, we're past Admiral Kirk's preface. We're past Gene Roddenberry's preface. We are into the first chapter. This is a part of the book that always stuck out to me as different, but not for the reasons that I guess it really should have. Or now I would say that it should have. But it stood out for me because I always thought it was really cool. He has it opens up with Captain Kirk. He's somewhere in the Mediterranean. Actually, we know exactly where he is. I'll tell you in a second. But he has an implant in his head that allows him to receive messages, not telepathically, but it allows him to receive messages on a certain frequency from Starfleet Command that works basically as a briefing. Okay, and it operates in it's sonopictorial, kind of like how dolphins talk to each other, where it is a mixture of language, picture, and feeling. Well, we don't know that dolphins talk with feeling, but I assume any language, effectively presents that. Now, there's the interesting tidbit just with this implant that he has. This is secretive technology. Now, I wish it was in the movie, but this is secretive technology. And the reason Kirk says that it's secretive technology is because in the early 21st century, there was this event called the mind control revolts, okay, which were, this exploration of mind control technology in Star Trek. And basically you find out that well, like it started in 2043 and then it ends up, getting banned and they don't explore it anymore. Similar to what would be described like with the eugenics wars, where humans would also stop genetic engineering. And so Starfleet doesn't tell anybody about these implants that Starfleet admirals and I guess maybe captains have, because they don't want to alarm anyone to the idea that, that potentially they could be used, say, for mind control. And it probably, that device alone probably would have ended up becoming a plot device, no pun intended, a plot device in future episodes or in future movies or something, where maybe the mind control revolts would start over again and some alien force would take over Starfleet admirals with that sort of thing. It could have been an interesting story, right? But again, it's like one line that you get. Now, the most incredible part of this, though, isn't even that. Just this opening little chapter. You find out about that character I mentioned earlier that Kirk had a love interest with, the Vice Admiral there, Ziana. But the most interesting thing is where Kirk is. He is at the Library of Alexandria. Now, I know that today there is a library at a place called Alexandria near the Mediterranean. I'm aware of that. No, you don't understand. So he is in the Library of Alexandria because I don't know if you want to call it a governing body, but you have what's called the Mediterranean Alliance that he describes, and they put up a dam at the Straits of Gibraltar, obviously for hydroelectric power and some other things, that dropped the Mediterranean, that drained it, quite a bit, to where it actually uncovered quite a few different things. It's like a hydroelectric complex, but they found the Library of Alexandria, and we know where the Library of Alexandria was, but it exposed like huge chunks of it, and all kinds of great works there. But not only that, but it also, he mentions like the Minoans, and that they find these Minoan and pre-Minoan ruins that point at some kind of ancient advanced civilization that nobody knew about before. This is right in the book. It's like one sentence in the first chapter, and you go, whoa, wait a minute, well, what's that? Now, the idea of the Mediterranean kind of being drained, actually, that's been explored. That was talked about. There was the episode of Star Trek The Next Generation in the 4th season where Picard goes back to the family vineyard, and has his fight with his brother Rene and everything. He gets offered to work, I think it's called the Atlantis Project, where they are wanting to make more land mass on Earth, and they are going to effectively drain the Mediterranean. And of course, this is a real idea. It's not like Gene Roddenberry had some brilliant idea. This is two things. One, we know that there are hundreds of cities in the Mediterranean, like underneath the water. Okay, we know that, because the Mediterranean wasn't always at the level that it's at. Two, it's been hypothesized, and I think even like the Nazis were going to try it for a century, the idea of draining the Mediterranean so that you could have more farmland and lots of other things. Will it ever happen? Not in the present world, and not because it's a bad idea or something. It's because you have a lot of people with a lot of money on basically lakeside real estate that they're not going to want to lose the value on. So that's probably the only reason that it wouldn't end up happening. But it wasn't that long ago in our past where the Mediterranean was significantly lower than it is. But for Star Trek to bring that up and then to claim that they found some kind of ancient advanced civilization pointing at the Minoans, which, look, I've theorized and pointed out, and I've said over the years, just on Sovryn Trek and other shows, that I think we are missing a lot of history, and the first place to look is at the Minoan civilization. Now I have to ask myself, wait, when did that start for me? Was it because of this unconsciously from the motion picture novel when I read it as a kid? I don't know, but I don't want to get lost on that. But that's there. But wait, there's more. Then you get, later on in the book, okay, there's two... It all happens during basically the sequence when the Enterprise is leaving the solar system, okay? And they're going by like Jupiter and moon and varying moons, and they're talking about Ganymede and everything, and they mention Io. And Kirk says to himself, in the book, as he's like looking at Ganymede, and he's like, oh, I haven't seen this view in a long time, blah, blah, blah. when they mention Io, they're like, yeah, scientists found some very interesting things on Io, but it's not nearly as, or some shocking. He actually uses the word shocking, but it's not nearly as shocking as what was discovered on Earth's moon, that there was some ancient spacefaring civilization that had a moon base there, that nobody knows who or what they were. It's like, well, wait a minute. Wait, you mean there's a moon base, like an ancient, to use ancient alien terms, I guess, like an ancient astronaut moon base on the moon, on Earth's moon? Why didn't Star Trek ever touch on that anymore? Like, and it just gets dropped like nothing. And even before that, there's this mention of what are called mutant farms that were an advanced civilization that knew about like Ganymede and these other moons, but he's talking about in prehistory. He specifically says these mutant farms in prehistory, but the knowledge of Jupiter's moons was a gift to them. Gift from who? Like all these little ideas. I mean, they're ancient astronaut theory ideas, but like a lot of these other things, I mean, they just constantly get dropped throughout this book, and you're like, oh fuck, tell us more. Give us more of this, please. And I don't know anywhere, and I've read a lot of Star Trek books. I could not begin to claim that I've read them all, but I've read a lot, and granted, they're not canon. And granted, technically, I guess Star Trek the Motion Picture novelization is not canon. But fuck, I'd love to know more about this stuff and whatever the hell Gene Roddenberry had in mind as far as that goes. And these are just like the little things that not even getting into the ideas, the ideology that he lays down in this book. But as far as ideology, that includes, there's an interesting comment about what Vulcans believe, that they have some kind of scientific evidence, even though they can't exactly explain it very well, that it sounds kind of like the whole universe is connected. It's kind of like that one concept that Spock gets all excited about in the third season episode Way to Eden. It kind of smacks of that. So, you hear a little bit more about that. And boy, speaking of Vulcan stuff. So this is the other thing, is this book is very sexy. Very, very sexy. And it is sex-filled. In fact, it's made pretty clear that Decker, which in the book also is confirmed to be the son of Matt Decker from the Doomsday Machine, the episode with the Planet Killer. But Decker fucks the Ilea probe. Not fucks Ilea, fucks the Ilea probe later on in the film. Even though we don't see that in the movie, that happens. Which I thought was, well, anyway, it was very interesting. But also you have where with Spock, there's a point where Spock, when he is on that mountain, was it Mount Gaul or whatever, when he is on Mount Gaul, on Vulcan, where he is trying to go through Kulinar and everything, and he is thinking about Kirk. Okay, and this is also when you hear the moment of contact that he has with V'ger telepathically. Okay, but he's thinking about Kirk, and he's calling him Tahila. Now, Tahila is a Vulcan word which can mean a couple different things, or it can mean all of them. It can mean best friend or lover. Like I could say Ellen is my Tahila, right? Because actually she's my best friend and my lover. And and it's funny because, or not funny, but it's great and really advanced, especially for a book in the 1970s, including science fiction, because there's commentary by Gene Roddenberry, basically, that Kirk is aware that people on Earth, like when the Enterprise comes back from the 5-year mission that you see in the original series, they all come back as larger-than-life heroes because, according to Roddenberry, that's like the first time one of these 5-year missions was really successful, and that everybody more or less came back intact and alive, and the captain didn't go insane. Okay? Which I have a comment to make about that. But regardless, Kirk realizes or discovers that people on Earth think that him and Spock are actually gay lovers. And Kirk doesn't mind that at all, and Spock doesn't seem to mind it either. They're not. Like Kirk says, he's like, well, I've always been into the other sex and so on, but like just for that to be openly talked about, admitted, and acceptable, I think is well ahead of its time for any book, to be so open about sexuality and homosexuality. And there's other examples of that. And basically, look, folks, you've got Decker sleeping with a machine. In fact, there's a funny line where Decker says, look, to save the Earth, I'll fuck a photon torpedo. I mean, that's or he says, I forget what word, he doesn't say fuck, but that's what he says. Is that he said he'd make love to a photon torpedo. Is really, really funny. But yeah, so I mean, so you have that concept of the Tehila, and some of the, which, I mean, that would lead into, and boy, I could have a conversation around that, because slash fiction for Kirk and Spock has been a part of Star Trek for as long as there's been Star Trek, and I applaud it and think it's beautiful. And I want to have a conversation around fan fiction and things like that. But maybe that's something I have to save for the next Sovryn Trek, because Gene Roddenberry has some very choice quotes from this era of Star Trek, when Star Trek fandom was at really a fever pitch. That's how you ended up with a movie, or what was originally going to be Phase 2, another TV show. Yeah, he had some interesting comments to make about fan fiction and fan productions, and well, anyway, I'll save that. Maybe we'll get into that in this conversation, but I might have to save it for another episode. So you get that exploration, with that. There's even an interesting thing about Dr. McCoy, who I think he's working with he studies the Fabrini, this alien race, and like Dr. Chapel, not Nurse Chapel in the movie, she's Dr. Chapel. Dr. Chapel describes how Dr. McCoy, his primary medical process is not to go into surgery. It is to incentivize and to bolster and help the body, like your natural healing organic processes, to engage. But if he has to do surgery, he will, but he doesn't like to do that. He wants the body more or less to heal itself, and that's like his common way of medicine. And I thought that was very interesting to explore. And I've heard, and I've referenced this in the past, there's that great interview that was before the motion picture came out on Tom Snyder's Tomorrow Show on NBC. This would have been in 76, 77, where DeForest Kelley, who played Dr. McCoy, even talks about that, how the body can heal itself and everything. And he, now I think he got that from an idea that Gene Roddenberry wanted to have in Star Trek. But you get that. There's so many other little ideological nuggets that just get dropped all over the place in this book that you're dying to know more about. You want to know more. You find out more about the Deltans. Like I said, you find out that they put out pheromones and everything, right? But it's also talked about how the Deltans, that they could have gone out into outer space hundreds of years previous, but they didn't until humanity encountered them. Because they instead, as advanced as they were, they wanted to explore, the inner universe. They wanted to explore inside themselves, and that's how they became so sexually mature and all of this. It's really interesting. And again, to talk about the sexuality of the book, there are plenty of times where the effects, the pheromone effect of Ilea on the ship, where it's basically saying that Sulu, Chekhov, Kirk, they're all getting boners and blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's really, it's really something. And there's even the shocking point that if the Ilea probe is really just a part of V'ger and V'ger's programming, that Decker was fucking V'ger. Which, I mean, the book plays on this. And so, like I said, it's a very, very sexual book. There are other instances as well, but I think you get my gist. Now, there's people who want to criticize Roddenberry for that, saying that basically he has the sexual maturity of a teenage boy. I don't think so, but it's amazing when I read it that I'm like, yeah, no, I can dig this. So again, I'm really, when I reread this, I can't help but wonder how much effect unconsciously this book had on me. But that speaks to what I was saying earlier about just how subversive Star Trek is. For anyone that encounters it really at any given point. So I suppose maybe if there is one major difference with the book, again, there's all these things to explore. And I just, was tip of the iceberg on this shit. Okay. One of the major differences between the book and the movie, and it's not something that might not have happened. It could have happened. We just didn't get the scene in the film. But basically Ilea, or the Ilea probe, does become, at the end of the movie, just before Decker's about to key in the final sequence to, for V'ger to touch the creator, right? Which, by the way, you also get more of an exploration of the machine planet that V'ger, that more or less repaired Voyager 6 and made V'ger what it is. And it hints at that it's not the Borg, but I think it can still fit in. But because Gene Roddenberry theorized that maybe that planet was actually the homeworld of the Borg. Anyway, that's besides the point. You also get, with V'ger including, actually, you also get some interesting, you get perspective from V'ger. You get like V'ger's thoughts, which is really, really fascinating stuff. So one of the major differences, though, is that at that moment when Decker is about to key in the final sequence to touch V'ger, at the very end of the film, Ilia does take over the Ilia probe. And because her memory patterns are there in such precision, Ilia effectively comes back to life. And so she's really kind of not dead. And so that makes a lot more sense as to why Decker is so willing to join with V'ger. Because Ilia really is back. It's not just a physical thing, which could be seen as shallow, right? No, that's literally Ilia. And even though it's a machine body. And I thought that was very interesting, to go that route. And then that whole last scene is going to lead us to that bigger conversation that I want to have. And this episode's going to go a lot longer than I expected. But regardless, let's just get into it. So the word transcendence gets used, I believe, by McCoy at this moment. And the moment in the movie when the big pillar of light goes up. It's a gorgeous special effects sequence. It really is. And everybody goes running back into the Enterprise and they're just trying to get out of there, and then V'ger blows up, blah, blah, blah. And, of course, we already knew that was, because it's in the commentary at the end that they just delivered a baby, right? It's a new life form. So this transcendence happens where it's a joining of a trinity that should not be lost on anybody, of V'ger, the machine, Ilia, and not really, it's Ilia's memory and, more or less her consciousness. It's not just like the Ilia probe. It's really more Ilia. And Decker. Now, it's interesting. And actually, I think, something, if I was Roddenberry, one thing I would have added here, it would have been really cool if V'ger was, if somehow you could tie in the planet killer from the Doomsday Machine into being from, say, the same planet as V'ger. That could have been really cool. There's already been stories where in other Star Trek books where you find out that the planet killers might have been designed to destroy the Borg by an ancient civilization. That's interesting, but whatever. But it would have been so, not poetic justice. There would have been something apropos. Let's put it that way. If you found out that V'ger was from the same planet as the planet killer, because then Decker is joining with technology that killed his dad. And I just thought that, when I was reading the book, I was like, oh, that would be so cool if they did that. And I suppose someone could be enterprising, but enough to still make that a reality. But regardless, so you have machine joining with Decker, the human, and having that creativity, and then you have, it is very Trinitarian, right? Because the Holy Spirit, God, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? The Holy Spirit, the Sophia, is, has feminine aspects to it, at least linguistically. So you do kind of get that play on there. And Decker, I guess, would be God the Father, and V'ger would be the Son, because V'ger is a child, right? That's what Spock keeps saying throughout it. So there's a Trinitarian aspect there, but this concept of transcendence, and I think it goes a little more than just, the movie hints at that. It is the joining of man and machine, right? It's the joining of perfect logic, which Spock keeps saying V'ger has, and the fallible human emotions, which Decker has. Okay. The novelization, I think, hints at it being so much more, in that V'ger inherits also Ilia's knowledge of the inner universe, right? Because they make a point that Deltans are really experienced at, inner psychology and a lot of this other stuff. So V'ger has knowledge of the universe, of space itself. And then Ilea has knowledge of, the inner universe. I mean, so you very much create the super being, but they also hint at, oddly enough, they recognize that Ilea was a very, she's Deltan and a very sexual creature. And so they expect V'ger to be, even though V'ger has transcended into this new kind of being, that new being, is probably pretty sexual. And I think it can't be ignored that Gene Roddenberry seems very obsessed from The Cage to the second pilot, which was Where No Man Has Gone Before. Okay, remember when Gary Mitchell becomes effectively a god? And through certain other, also like even just the creation of the Q, which was a Gene Roddenberry invention with The Next Generation. Gene Roddenberry seems, and I mean, even just remember the episode Hyde and Q, and remember when Picard quotes Hamlet, and it like a really epic moment when he's talking to Q, and he says, "What a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, infinite in faculty, how like an angel, how like a god," right? Like he gives that whole speech. Gene Roddenberry, and we're going to get into this in a second, I have one more comment I want to make about the ending, but Gene Roddenberry does seem to have an obsession with humanity evolving into some kind of godhood. Okay, and it smacks very much. That wasn't like necessarily a new idea. I mean, maybe in the 60s it would have been, but in the 70s you would have, Battlestar Galactica did this, right? Glenn Larson even said that one of his initial premise for Battlestar Galactica in 78 was the Mormon concept of as man is, God once was. As God is, man can become. And I think Gene Roddenberry was also playing off of that notion a lot, and he was trying to point things as far as like things being what ought to be. I think he was pointing in that direction, and maybe he was going to explore that more with the New Humans in the book, which the New Humans sound very much like something out of an Olaf Stapleton novel, don't they? I mean, they really like the unity aspect of it, a lot of it in there really smacks of that, and I would not be surprised if Gene Roddenberry was very familiar with Olaf Stapleton's work and considered, evolving in those directions that he would cover in Star Maker and Last and First Men. Because also we know, and this is a very interesting thing, is that, and I didn't know this until recently when I was reading a lot of older stuff by Gene Roddenberry, is he would talk to Isaac Asimov all the time. He would just say, yeah, me and Isaac were talking, like he'd be so casual and offhand about it. And I never knew they had that close of a relationship. In the credits for Star Trek The Motion Picture that Isaac Asimov was like a creative supervisor. You're aware of that. You knew there was some kind of relationship. And if you have the Star Trek The Motion Picture soundtrack, 2-disc soundtrack that came out I think it came out in 98, even though it was for the 20th anniversary. It comes with that record, that LP that came out in the 70s called Inside Star Trek that was all like interviews with the cast of Star Trek and everything. That was a way of like capitalizing on that fever pitch in Star Trek fandom in the 1970s. He does an interview with Isaac Asimov in that, and Asimov loves Star Trek. I mean, he just absolutely fucking loves it, which is probably why he didn't mind having his name slapped onto Star Trek The Motion Picture, right? But having that kind of relationship with royalty, basically, for lack of a better phrase, in science fiction, I think Roddenberry would be familiar with a lot of that. Now, we have a lot more to explore on that part of the conversation, but I want to get back to, it's important to recognize that Gene was looking at, humanity reaching what is effectively a godhood. And that was a driving force probably in a lot of Star Trek that has in many ways been ignored. You might want to say that Deep Space Nine kind of explored that with Sisko, right, being the emissary. But let's be clear here, or I am of the opinion, how about this? I am of the opinion that Deep Space Nine, as amazing, great, wonderful, brilliant, fucking awesome of a show that it is, and it is, that it was copying Babylon 5. So, but we can leave that there. So now the other thing to point out about the ending, okay, and that is that all of these little hints of there being like ancient civilizations on Earth, or like an alien moon base on Earth's moon, from thousands of years previous, or million, actually it suggests it's millions of years previous, because it says that they were messing with the DNA of life on Earth millions of years before humanity, came onto the stage. Okay. All those things, I think, while they are interesting ideas that Star Trek could have gone nuts with, and also point at the original script, one of the original scripts for what would eventually be the motion picture, that being Star Trek Planet of the Titans, okay, I think that was a way of throwing at least the reader, and if it was in the movie, it would have thrown off the viewer from, you would probably think that, oh, there's these ancient civilizations. Well then, V'ger must have been created, when he's looking for the creator on Earth, he must be referencing those ancient advanced civilizations, those pre-Minoan civilizations. So I think it would have been a way of throwing that off. And that's a clever narrative technique. That's well done, because they seem offhand and you want more from them. And maybe you get to expecting that at the end you're going to find out, oh, this is what V'ger's all about. This is why he's going to Earth. But no, you find out it was just, it was Voyager 6, right? And it was humans from just a couple centuries previous. So, yeah, I'm just bringing that up, that I thought that was very, very good writing and lead up on Gene Roddenberry's part. Now, I want to skip back. So I guess, because we're going to get into our big conversation here. Okay. And so I want to go back to that notion about godhood. Okay. About, humanity reaching some type of godhood. But to put it simply, as far as like an end review for Star Trek: The Motion Picture, the novel, I think it's a stunning book. I easily now say that it's like the best Star Trek novel ever written, because it's so tantalizing, for one. It does stick to the very hard ideals of Star Trek, even to the point that it is mentioned that humanity is questioning the existence of Starfleet itself because of its militaristic possibilities. Which I've always given Star Trek: The Motion Picture, the movie, the credit for that, in that it was the movie where Starfleet didn't fire a shot, other than at a asteroid, obviously, because it could have destroyed the ship, and that just makes sense. It is the non-violent film, and I criticize people for not liking that movie. And I think they don't like it because of the lack of violence in it, and I think that speaks to how not evolved humanity is right now. Now, granted, Star Trek: The Motion Picture, the movie, is going through a renaissance right now. And I'm glad for that, for a few reasons, some of which I don't know if I'll get to in this episode. It might be in the next, okay? Because Star Trek is in need of its own renaissance, because Star Trek, in my opinion, is in trouble right now. It's bad. And it's a shame, because Star Wars is in many ways in trouble right now, and if Star Trek wanted to overtake Star Wars, now is the time, but they're going to miss that ball. And, well, really, if Rise of Skywalker ends up actually being a good movie, they'll have completely missed their opportunity. You can say that there's room for both. Yes, there is, but also it would have been nice for Star Trek to be seen by most as the the superior franchise, but that's just 7-year-old me talking. So speaking of 7-year-old me, so I have been into science fiction forever. I've been into Star Trek forever. My dad was into science fiction and Star Trek. Speaking of, connective tissue, my dad worked on the Voyager program, of all things. Obviously, Voyager 6 wasn't a real probe. We stopped at Voyager 2. But, you could say I take it a little bit personally. A brilliant man, in many ways, my father. And so, you could say that he got me into this stuff early on. Sure, that's fine. Regardless, it's been a part of me for so long. And I've often had a sit down with myself, some self-awareness, and would say over the years, and trust me, this has to do with Star Trek and Gene Roddenberry specifically, I would say to myself, Brian, why do you give such a shit? Why do you, you'd almost die on the hill for science fiction. What's with that? It's just fiction. And I think deep down, I've always known that that's not true. But this year, in 2019, along with many other things and many other books that I've read that have just expanded my mind, dare I say, immeasurably. Not that it's changed my outlook on life. I'm always going to be an egoist, because that's what we're born as. Okay, but nothing's changing there. But I've learned so much about, especially history and history of ideas and certain things that I've been into and come to a lot of realizations, even within the entertainment space and so on. It's been a very mind-expanding year, 2019. As much as it hasn't been like the best year in a lot of ways too. Too many deaths, the wrong deaths, and I mean, there's not right ones either. But yeah. So yeah, I think I always knew, no, there's something different about science fiction. And sometimes I've been able to, kind of put terms to that. Meaning that, the idea that science fiction is a mental tool. This is not my idea. This is something other people have talked about, not just science fiction authors, technologists, and lots of other people have talked about this. That science fiction is a tool that allows your brain, your thought process, to engage the very modern world, the right now, where things are just changing by the second and by the tweet, right? It is a way for you to handle the amount of change happening around you, the speed at which things are happening around you, which is unprecedented in recorded human history. And I have more or less called this the science fiction method. Okay, like the scientific method is a way of engaging the evidence of the universe. The science fiction method is similar. It is a way of engaging the ramifications of the evidence of the universe, or the ramifications of what comes out of what gets created and brought into life into this universe. And it's a powerful thing. Now, as far as I know, I'm the only person that's ever said the science fiction method, but certainly that term, but the abstract notion, others have come to that conclusion as well. But it's actually much deeper than this. And there is a book, and I consider this to understand the world we live in today. And you'd say, well, this is just about science fiction. How could this have such broad ramifications? This is one of the most important books you could ever possibly read. I know a lot of people want to say that about a lot of books. Okay, this is not the Four Arguments or some other horse shit like that. This is the real deal. The book is called Astounding. That's the title. Okay, it has a subheader, that being John W. Campbell, Isaac Asimov, Robert A. Heinlein, L. Ron Hubbard, and the Golden Age of Science Fiction. It's by Alec Novella Lee. It came out in actually just about a year ago to the day. October 23rd, 2018 is when it came out. It is about 13 hours. Okay, so, it's got a little length to it. But everybody should read this book. Because it opens up. So Astounding, the title, comes from the magazine that was, made famous and published by John W. Campbell. Of course, originally be, Amazing Stories and so on, but then later on it would become Astounding magazine, okay, which in varying forms still exists today. Now, the book opens up, and I've talked about this if not in Sovryn Trek episodes, I've talked about it on Zomia ONE Underground Q&As. The book opens up with a meeting in the 60s held by one of the guys that would work with President Kennedy, basically saying, hey, all these technologies, a lot of other stuff, it's going to be unleashed on the world. We are stepping into uncharted territory. How do we prepare everybody for this? Because most people aren't going to be able to handle it. And the conclusion basically comes to that, we need that thought leaders are needed. People that can communicate the modern age that's coming into being. And Isaac Asimov is there in Boston, where this is being held, okay, right in the Northeast. And Isaac Asimov says, I've got it. Find the people that are into good science fiction, that read good science fiction. Those are the people that are going to be able to, to help bring on this world. And that's the opening premise of this book. And then it just goes into this whole history about how John W. Campbell basically cat-herded all the big names in the golden age of science fiction, from Isaac Asimov, to Heinlein, L. Ron Hubbard, like him or not, and hopefully not, Ray Bradbury, A.E. Van Vogt. Go down. Harlan Ellison's talked about it. And every major player, Damon Knight. Just go down the list. Every major player in science fiction that has basically created the genre as we understand it today, notwithstanding, H.G. Wells, Olaf Stapledon, Jules Verne, and so on. Not counting people before John W. Campbell. Okay, but through his magazine, Astounding or Amazing Stories, John W. Campbell brought all this to being. And here's what you find out throughout all this, though, is that John W. Campbell, like him or not, and I don't mind if you say or not, because plenty of these Golden Age science fiction writers who he made famous, Frank Herbert, I mean, whoever, who he helped make famous, or was central to their careers, and thus central to science fiction being anything that it is right now. And look, folks, without Isaac Asimov, you're not going to have Star Wars. You're not going to have Star Trek as you know it. Like, you're just not. I mean, because how much of Star Wars is the Foundation trilogy, right? in many ways. You're certainly, like Trantor and all that. But regardless, okay, he, John Campbell, he had an idea. He thought that humanity needed to evolve to this next level, kind of like we were talking about with Roddenberry, humanity reaching some kind of godhood, that humanity needed to reach this next level if it was going to survive. Because guess what, folks, whatever, they, and there's some credibility to this, that John Campbell predicted nuclear power and the atomic bomb. Like, he knew that was coming. And again, that speaks to, science fiction's ability to predict certain things, because you kind of put together the pieces of what's happening, you turn that into a fictional narrative, and you might actually end up with what the future might actually look like, or something in the future might actually look like. And so John Campbell was this cat herder of all of these guys who were writing. John Campbell had this purpose, and he would more or less force his writers, because if they didn't do it, he wouldn't publish their shit, to write stories that were about humanity getting to this next level of evolution. Okay, a new way of thinking. For example, like general semantics would be a big deal. Dianetics would be a big deal. Scientology, not so much. And in fact, this is also an interesting history of Scientology, that basically Dianetics and Scientology are not the same thing. And that, well, anyway, that's a sidebar to all of this. Okay, just please read this book. But John Campbell brought all of the great science fiction authors that most of the engineers, like my dad and some others, and most others, that would work for NASA and whatever else, he brought them all together and inspired this entire generation that got us into space, created computers, did all this other stuff. Or, the more modern computer, granted, the concept of the computer was done by, Ada Lovelace. Long before John Campbell was a gleam in his mom's eye. But what brought science fiction, which I think very much brought on the modern world that we live in, the interconnected world that we live in, whether or not it predicted the internet, regardless, it inspired the people that would build it. It brings all of this on, and he very much, he brought on the future. Actually from Mirror Mirror, the episode of the original series, where Spock says to Kirk, Mirror Spock says to Prime Kirk that, one man can't change the present. And he says, but one man can summon the future. That's what Kirk responds with. In fact, that's kind of the inspiration for my Sovryn Trek phrase, be the future. And John Campbell was that, in many ways, that one man that summoned the future. Whether it was through his own ideas or through his, making careers for other people with huge ideas that inspired so much. So you can't downplay the importance of Astounding magazine and of John Campbell and those golden age science fiction writers. But now here's the interesting thing. So John Campbell was doing that when TV and even radio were not the entertainment du jour. When the magazine, the pulp magazine, the novel, and all that was, that was the main way that people took in entertainment. Fast forward to the 60s, and so let me step back a second. So John Campbell was really the godfather of science fiction. Okay, even though I think they give that title to other people. He was the godfather of science fiction. And he had a purpose. He had a point to what he was putting out there as far as science fiction. It was about inspiring the real world, changing reality, changing the real world, and getting humanity to some higher level of, mental maturity, or who knows what, maybe more. Okay, that was his purpose. So science fiction, modern science fiction, as we understand it, and I would argue that Olaf Stapledon, even before Campbell, and H.G. Wells and Jules Verne were also on this same path. But with Campbell, we know for sure that, he's the guy that created science fiction as we understand it, or gave the careers to the people that did, and he had a purpose: to change the world. Not to write entertaining, mindless fiction. It had a point: to change the world. It was a philosophical experiment. A mental one, yes. I mean, it wasn't like, it's not the Free State Project or something, right? But it was a philosophical experiment being engaged in on the world en masse. And it's a tremendous history to learn about. But now, get into the 60s, and television does take over the world. Okay, television does become the medium that takes over from the novel and the magazine and so on, and starts that slow decline, right? When television becomes a big deal, Gene Roddenberry, and this is only like in the last couple chapters of the book, and this is the part, all of that about John Campbell and Astounding magazine was really, really fascinating stuff and mind-altering for me. But what they talk about with Gene Roddenberry really, really shook me up. Because what you find out is that Gene Roddenberry was basically the television version of John Campbell. He had the same idea, that Gene Roddenberry had such and so much ideas that he wanted to put out into the world. He had these morality plays, and he was bringing in the best science fiction writers of his day. Ted Sturgeon, David Gerald, go down the list. He was bringing in all these guys. He was doing, Star Trek was so this is the part that I didn't know. No matter how much I've ever read about Star Trek, I didn't know until I read this book, Astounding. Which is an astounding book. Star Trek was basically a science fiction anthology series. Okay, it was basically Roddenberry. It had a consistent set of characters. Okay, but it was set up to be Astounding magazine on television, to where you do all these, morality plays, exploration of future ideas, and talking about where humanity can go and be. Much like I read to you that excerpt from the novel of the motion picture, okay, that he wanted to show how we could be, which is exactly what John Campbell was doing when he made the careers of Heinlein, Asimov, Hubbard, and so on. Roddenberry was doing the same thing. So Star Trek had a point. Yes, from the get-go. Its purpose was to change, it was genuinely to be subversive. Roddenberry can just say, oh no, it's just a wagon train to the stars. Oh no. No, the evidence stands quite in contrast. This was about, and Roddenberry has said as much anyway, that it wasn't just a wagon train to the stars. That was just the sales pitch to NBC. But it was about changing now. It was a play in the future, changing now. And that was its purpose from that point. And that's what he gets to in that opening to Star Trek, the motion picture. And so this idea of, and suddenly, you watch Where No Man Has Gone Before, the second pilot and the first episode of the original series as we know it, you watch that and suddenly you go, oh, this is about Roddenberry pointing at that humanity can be so much more. He's setting the stage for what Star Trek is really all about. Now, here's where there's an issue with this, and this is going to point into our next part here, okay? Brandon Braga, Rick Berman, a lot of people, when Voyager was starting to run a little bit, I think, or people felt the idea is that Star Trek was going stale come the time of Voyager. I don't think that's true, but that's apparently what the popular perception was, because, I don't know, ratings were going down or what, who knows. And Rick Berman would famously come out and basically say, and Brandon Braga would back this up, and basically say, Star Trek isn't about telling you how we need to act and be in the 24th century, because I guess he felt like people were taking the show way too seriously. and we're using it as like for lack of a better phrase, an ethical code base, okay, or like a philosophical base that you would build off from. Rick Berman's a liar, because no, we know now for a fact, be it from the novelization of Star Trek the Motion Picture, be it from the book Astounding and Gene Roddenberry's original goals for Star Trek, it absolutely was about how humanity ought to be. That was the point. That was the point of science fiction in general, and it sure as fuck was the point of its flagship show, no pun intended, Star Trek. So Rick Berman is dead wrong. Okay, maybe Rick Berman didn't want it to be that, because it would end up calling, Star Trek would effectively have to start calling bullshit on all kinds of things, like what Gene Roddenberry was exploring in the novel of the motion picture, that, oh, maybe Starfleet's not a good idea. Yeah, I mean, even though, amazingly, in The Next Generation, you do get that great quote from Moriarty when he sees the Starfleet security officers, and he says, it's like, policemen, I recognize them in any century. Basically recognizing that Starfleet is, authoritarianism. But I think Berman knew, and Berman was basically the hitman for the studios. Okay. We'll talk more about that in a second. He knew, or I think he knew, or maybe the studios knew, that, wow, if we keep building on top of this, like, we're going to get in trouble with the powers that be in the world, right? Because that's where it would go. And Gene Roddenberry was ready to go there back in 1979, right? As it can kind of be seen through the novelization of the motion picture. Now, this leads to a point that I don't think I completely realized until recently. And that is, I mean, there's things I knew. Like, I knew Gene Roddenberry left the original series at the end of the second season. I knew that he died basically around the time of the third season of The Next Generation. The things I didn't really know was really how little of what we know of as Star Trek was, green-lighted, an idea based off of thoughts, whatever, influenced by Gene Roddenberry. Very little Star Trek is. Basically, you have the first two seasons of Star Trek, okay, in the cage. You have those. That's Gene Roddenberry and Gene Kuhn and Herb Solow. I mean, not to take anything away from that. But then also, you have the animated series, but Gene wasn't apparently that, pleased with his own work on that, so whatever, he doesn't talk about it much. But I still think that's a brilliant show, as I said earlier. And then you have a chunk of the motion picture, and you have the novelization, which he definitely had control over. But you find out throughout the motion picture that a lot of the reports that the motion picture was not successful, we know now that's not true. In fact, some of those numbers, like budgetary numbers that everybody levied against Gene Roddenberry at the time, were basically fudged and massaged by Paramount at the time, because now we know, as of 2014, we finally got some numbers from some of the foreign investors involved with Star Trek the Motion Picture in the 70s that actually, like, Star Trek the Motion Picture is more successful than the J.J. Abrams films. I mean, like, it was a wild success. But Paramount didn't want anybody to know that. And the reason they didn't want anybody to know that is because they wanted to take control away from Gene Roddenberry, probably because, like you read in the novelization of Star Trek the Motion Picture, which is the purest form of Gene Roddenberry's ideas for the Star Trek future, they're worried he was crazy. And they didn't want to go there. Like, whoa, we're not going to let, gay relationships between Kirk and Spock or anybody go live, right? I mean, and we know that Paramount felt that way because they ran into that with early scripts in the first couple seasons of The Next Generation. It was the same problem. So he had the motion picture, and again, he had the first couple seasons of The Next Generation. But the funny thing is that you talk to a lot of fans of The Next Generation, they don't like the first two seasons of The Next Generation. They don't think the show came into its own until the third season. Now, they're not exactly wrong. Certainly, it feels like the show goes from 5 to 13 once you get into the third season and you end up doing Best of Both Worlds and a lot of this other stuff. It's pretty, it does seem like kind of a different show. It's not just the uniforms that change. But what did change is that once again, Gene Roddenberry basically got ousted out of the production of Star Trek: The Next Generation. He had he would send notes and whatever during the production of the films, 2 through 6 and whatever else. And apparently everybody just ignored those. Nobody paid any attention to those, which is probably why 2 through 6 Starfleet does feel so militaristic, because again, Roddenberry was trying to make commentary a bit against that. Okay. It's pretty earth-shattering to realize just how little influence Gene Roddenberry really had over his creation in ways that, when most people think about it. I mean, we always knew that, he didn't think Deep Space Nine was a good idea. I'm not saying like that everything Gene Roddenberry thought was gold. I'm not going to make that claim, because there's so much Star Trek that clearly would never have happened if Gene Roddenberry were in charge, that I love, and I'm very passionate about. But then I also have to admit to myself that, you might as well not even put his name on this shit, because it's so far and away from what he had in mind. Another quick thing, this idea that, like with Star Trek Discovery, that that Burnham was like the first mutineer in Starfleet. In Star Trek: The Motion Picture, the novel, that's not true. Like, you instantly know that's not true, because they talk about a ton of mutinies that occurred, in the early days of Starfleet. And, even in Discovery, it's not the early days of Starfleet. So this mutineer, her being the first mutineer thing, that clearly wasn't a part of the original concepts of Star Trek. But then again, that leads to the point that so much of what we know of Star Trek today, not just Discovery, not just what CBS has done recently, but so much of Star Trek that we've known really ever since like 1989 is not Gene Roddenberry's vision. And I'm a little annoyed by it, because there is, especially in the late 90s, there was so much consistent lip service to, this is Gene's vision, this is Gene's vision. When no, it wasn't. Gene's vision is the motion picture novelization. That is the purest form of Gene's vision of what Star Trek is and what the future would be like. If you want to know what Gene Roddenberry thought, that's what he thought. And when you read it, you're going to realize one thing for sure, is there's a whole shit ton of sex, and it gets freaky in the future. And I say applause. 3 cheers. So Star Trek had a point. It had a purpose. Okay, Gene Roddenberry had a very unique concept for, or had not, they weren't unique, but a unique amalgamation of ideas that where he wanted Star Trek to go, and it never got the chance to go there. And I am frankly disappointed, disheartened Discovery has sucked ass. There's points that I've liked about it, and I've been positive about it, but it has not lived up to its potential. I'm not going to do a review here of any of the trailers from New York Comic Con, but I'll just say quickly, I saw the trailer for season 3 of Discovery, and it looked like, I've seen some steaming piles of shit in my day. This is like on the order of a Triceratops in Jurassic Park. That looks like a steaming pile of shit, other than Morn running around with some kind of phaser. That was kind of cool. Or one of Morn's species. They look so bad. Anyway. Discovery's been... Picard has to be a good show. Otherwise, I'm just going to say fuck it, Star Trek. But Star Trek has fallen the apple has fallen so far from the tree. It's horrible. And I hate the fact that I am reading stuff. I should not be reading a book from 1979 and thinking like, wow, those ideas sound revolutionary in 2019, 40 years later to the day. Why? Why should those ideas read as like, amazing and revolutionary, and fuck, I'd love to see that. And yeah, let's have that be the future, and so on. Why should that be 40 years later? What an insult to us as a species. And what an insult to the people involved in Star Trek throughout much of that 40-year history. because they fuck shit up. I mean, look, you watch season 3 of the original series, and yeah, you can tell it kind of lost its way. I mean, sure, the budget's dropped, but like even they relied on strange narrative hooks of like not telling you what's going on until towards the end of the episode or something to try and keep you interested. They weren't, using like actual clever ideas and ideologies, which is what the show was exploring in the first couple seasons. You didn't have great character interaction, which is what you had in the first couple seasons. Something was lost, in the third season without Gene Roddenberry there. There's no doubt about that. Okay, not to say that the original series is perfect. I want to have a huge conversation around the fact that Kirk is an asshole. Like, I mean, he's not a good guy. Like, I've been very disillusioned over him as a character. Now, in the movies, he's awesome, but in the original series, I have questions. But of course, Spock is great. But I mean, I've made that point in other episodes that I really think Star Trek is really all about Spock, and Spock is ultimately maybe that next evolution that Gene Roddenberry was trying to point at. But regardless, of all that, I think we were somewhat fortunate that Brannon Braga, at least initially, was involved in The Next Generation, come season 3 and beyond. Because Brannon, at least at the time, was pretty libertarian, and so he would get some revolutionary ideas in the 90s, certainly, or late 80s and early 90s, out. So I appreciated that, and maybe that's what kept it interesting, even though you lost the driving philosophical force of Gene Roddenberry. Now, I've seen the documentary, was it Trek Nation or whatever, where it's Eugene Roddenberry, his son, not Gene, but Eugene Roddenberry, and Herb Salo, talking about how like Gene wouldn't get scripts in on time. I had to keep reining Gene in and blah, blah, blah. And I had to stand on his desk and all of this. I mean, I've seen that, but I don't think, you can't, Gene Roddenberry being some scatterbrain guy who wasn't behind the philosophies of Star Trek, that guy could not have been the same guy that wrote Star Trek the Motion Picture, the novel. And again, understand that the movie is not so much the novel. I mean, they don't contradict each other, but already during production of Star Trek the Motion Picture, Paramount was playing games to get Gene out of there, and Harold Livingston and others were basically stepping in and doing all the rewrites and whatever. Okay. God, it's gotta be so painful, because like Gene was just paying lip service for decades. Saying, yeah, this is my Star Trek, blah, blah, blah. When it wasn't his, he didn't have control of it or any influence at all. But, that crazy Gene Roddenberry can't be, I get it. Like the book, the novelization of the motion picture reads like it's done by a crazy man, but a crazy man who's right in many ways, not all, or who had some genuinely awesome ideas. I mean, you can't tell me that. And it's a shame, because again, the failure, or the perceived, because it's not really that, and we know that only now in the 21st century, the perceived failure of the motion picture kept Gene Roddenberry from basically getting to do any other project that he wanted to in Hollywood. And what a pity, because I think he had some fucking badass ideas. I mean, I've watched plenty of his other stuff. Granted, later on, in the 90s and early aughts, you'd have Earth Final Conflict, you'd have Andromeda, which were based off of Gene Roddenberry story treatments. Not Star Trek, but, different ideas. And those are certainly interesting. And he did other stuff too. He did Genesis 2, Quester tapes, and so on. And I actually like a lot of that. Yeah, but I wonder what Star Trek would really look like if Gene kept control. And I wonder what other content we would have out there from Gene if he didn't have the blemish against him of Star Trek the Motion Picture. I mean, it almost makes me feel like that this idea that the motion picture sucked, especially now that people seem to be appreciating the film, I almost feel like that was, almost a conspiracy. That was Paramount, the studios, like telling people to think that it sucked. Like putting in and hiring all the movie critics to say, oh, the movie was slow paced and terrible and blah, blah, blah. Because now, again, a lot of people have changed their tune. They're like, oh no, Star Trek the Motion Picture is a fucking amazing movie. And good for them. And maybe it's because Gene Roddenberry had such great ideas. And maybe it's because, I don't know, the studios or whoever realized what I was talking about earlier, that Star Trek is that incredibly subversive force. It is that subversive piece of fiction that has literally brought on the modern world by hook or crook. You know, whether Gene Roddenberry's there or not, the skeleton is still there, and the skeleton is enough, just like the skeleton of a T-Rex. It's enough to inspire awe in us and make us wonder and bring out perhaps the best in us. And I think I'm going to end with that because we're already over 2 hours. But I just want to end with saying Star Trek needs to be subversive again. Someone needs to step up to the plate and make the Star Trek that Gene Roddenberry had in mind. Someone's got to do it. And you could say, oh, holy shit, but CBS, Paramount, which they're the same company now, you know, look what they did to Axanar. They're going to come and get us. Well, maybe I'll have that, we'll explore that in the next episode of Sovryn Trek, and I'll have that come out very soon. But let me assure you, anyone that wants to take that on, Gene Roddenberry would have had your back. And maybe I'll get into those quotes in the next Sovryn Trek. So anyway, that's it for this episode. I had a lot to cover here. I mean, months worth of thinking over Star Trek, especially since, you know, we've gotten all the short treks and so much of the other news coming out around Star Trek. We'll get into a lot more of that in the next episode of Sovryn Trek, but there's a lot of things I've been wanting to share with you that I feel like I finally got a chance, and that novelization was a great impetus and just put it all together as to what's really wrong with Star Trek right now. But that doesn't mean there isn't some hope down the line. And let's explore that maybe next time. Anyway, that's it for this episode of Sovryn Trek. This is Brian Sovryn, and I'll see all of you on the other side. Or maybe in the future. Wouldn't that be nice?